Choosing the right PC for architecture is hard, especially if you're not tech savvy and you're doing it for the first time. Terms like RTX, SSD, motherboard, Ryzen, core clock, GPU speed, DDR5, liquid cooling, CPU fan can be scary because you may not know which components are the most important when it comes to drafting, 3D modeling, BIM, but at the same time, you want to get the best machine for your budget.
Think about CPU or central processing unit as the brain of your computer. It's the single most important component responsible for the speed and efficiency of your system. Any program you run, whether it's Photoshop, Rhino, Revit, AutoCAD, or Chrome browser, or even Notion, they all start with your processor. The more powerful your CPU is, the more efficient your work will be. In my opinion, when you're building a new computer, the choice of the CPU is the most important one. And it will also influence the type of motherboard you need, and also that motherboard will influence the compatibility with other parts, so it's all connected.
The best way to check if your motherboard is compatible with your CPU is to look at the specs of both products. For example, if you take a look at this processor, AMD Ryzen 7950X, we can see that CPU socket is AM5. And then you have the list of supporting chipsets. Every single motherboard has its chipset, and it's usually located in the name of the motherboard. So now if you take a look at the specs of this motherboard, you will see the chipset is AMD X670. And it also supports AM5 CPU socket, which means that this motherboard and this CPU are 100% compatible. In case you want to check this compatibility even faster, there is a website called pcpartpicker.com, where you can simply click this button, choose your desired CPU, and then when you click to choose the motherboard, it will only list the motherboards which are already compatible with that CPU, which is going to save you tons of time on researching this manually. And once you pick your motherboard, you can also check on the manufacturer's website or here to see which RAM memory is compatible with your system, and the same goes for SSD or your video card.
There are two major brands of CPUs, Intel and AMD. Some time ago, AMD was beating Intel by a lot in every single aspect, like performance or price, but recently Intel caught up and their newest generation of CPUs are great. So, whichever brand you choose, you'll be fine, but I personally prefer AMD. When choosing a CPU, it's important to know what is the difference between CPU core count and clock speed. Core count is the number of individual CPU cores that can run in parallel. For example, let's say that you want to use multiple tools at the same time, like Rhino, Photoshop, Revit, AutoCAD. So if you had only one core, your CPU would be overwhelmed by using all of these tools simultaneously, and it would really be quite slow on the system. That's why having multiple cores solves this problem, because each core is dedicated to one application, and they can all run smoothly at the same time.
For example, you can see these cores working whenever you're using a bucket rendering setup with V-Ray. All these rectangles represent a single core, and how fast that rectangle finishes its job depends on the CPU clock speed. We measure this speed in gigahertz units, and the higher the number is, the faster your CPU will be.
Another important thing you need to know about CPUs is the difference between CPU core and CPU thread. Maybe it's best to illustrate it this way. Think of your CPU as a team of architects working on the same project.
Each CPU core is like one architect. If you have one architect, they can only work on one task at a time, such as designing a floor plan, let's say. But if you have more architects or more cores, each one can work on different tasks. One can design the floor plan, another one can design 3D models, another one can create renderings, and so on. The more architects or cores you have, the more tasks can be done at the same time, and that will speed up your project. And now a CPU thread is like giving each architect the ability to handle two parts of a task at once. For example, while one architect is working on the floor plan, they can also co-create sections at the same time, or essentially doing multitask. So even if you have the same number of architects or cores, with more threads, each one can handle more work at the same time, improving the overall efficiency when you're using any of our programs for architecture.
In short, more cores mean more architects to work on different tasks, and more threads mean each architect can do more things at once. More cores and more threads are usually always, of course, a better choice. Now, about my recommendations for CPU in 2024. This really depends on when you're going to watch this video, because new generations of CPUs are always going to be better option than the older generation. So Keep in mind that these recommendations are valid for fourth quarter of 2024.
Here you have three options. These are currently priced from $140 for the entry-level CPU to $650 for the high-end CPU. You can see the differences in specs for all three products here. Just keep in mind that if you're tight on a budget and if you need to make priorities, make sure that CPU is really the number one priority and that you should allocate more cash here than in other components.
CPU coolers. What is that and why would you even care? Well, if you're buying one of these recommended high-end CPUs that I mentioned, you need to know that cooling these CPUs is equally important, because if you don't have the proper cooler, the CPU may overheat and this may physically damage it. So you really need to think about getting it cooled in the proper way. The mid-range and low-end CPUs are usually a bit more forgiving, so you may use the stock cooler that comes with the CPU, but on the high-end CPUs, choosing the right cooler is extremely important.
There's a very useful app called HW Info that you can install on your system, and it monitors all of the temperatures including CPU and GPU. When you're doing heavy tasks and you have multiple programs running, you can check it out and see how your temperatures look like.
If your CPU temperature is below 80 degrees Celsius under pressure, you don't need to worry about cooling. But if you notice temperatures over 90 degrees and higher, that is the first sign that you need to check your coolers. When it comes to these cooling systems, you have two that are most common. These are the air cooling system, which is the one I recommend, and the liquid cooling system.
Air cooling consists of fans that are mounted throughout your PC case and on your CPU, and the goal of this system is to have a clear flow path of where the air is going to go. So they're either blowing air inside or blowing air outside the PC case, depending on the configuration of your fan.
These fans are regulating temperature inside your case where all the parts are located, but more importantly, you need a special CPU cooler whose sole purpose is to cool down your CPU only. Once again, if you have a high-end CPU, you should consider getting the best CPU air cooler on the market, such as Noctua NH-D15G2.
These Noctua coolers are considered to be one of the best performing coolers while producing the least amount of noise, so that's why I can recommend them. However, the only drawback here is that these CPU coolers have special mounting hardware that you need to install on your motherboard so they don't fall off or put too much tension on the motherboard, because they are a bit heavy and bulky. Since they're a bit bigger, keep in mind that your PC case needs to be a bit wider, so anything from 23 centimeters and above would be fine. Another drawback is that if you have a smaller PC case and you need to place your GPU in the top slot of your motherboard, it will be very close to that CPU cooler. There's nothing wrong with this, but in general, you would want to allow the GPU to have a little bit more clearance and breathing room so it doesn't overheat. The second solution is to use liquid cooling. Liquid cooling is a much cleaner and prettier system because it's not bulky, and it consists of a couple of radiators and pipes that are connected to your CPU and GPU.
This system is considered to be more efficient than air cooling because mostly runs on water. But if you're not prepared for possible collateral damage, if something breaks in that system, then don't do it. I'm saying this because if some of those pipes break, or if you have any sort of leakage, that can ruin not only your CPU, but also your motherboard and all other parts inside. So for that reason, I never wanted to install liquid cooling in any of my systems, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't, just know that there are risks involved. After you've chosen your CPU and CPU cooler, the next big important decision is your graphics card or your GPU. Keep in mind that some processors today have graphics chip inside of them, which means that you don't necessarily need to buy graphics cards for your system to work, but this is really not recommended if you're serious about using your system for architecture. So having a good graphics card is essential, and I wouldn't even consider not getting it simply because programs that we use for architecture, for rendering, for modeling are hungry for GPU power. Okay, so why do we need graphics card?
The first reason is simple. When you're 3D modeling, the GPU helps display and move your models smoothly on the screen. While the CPU handles the processing of changes, your GPU ensures those changes are shown as quickly as possible on your monitor. For example, in real-time rendering engines like D5 or Twinmotion, the GPU does the heavy work. It calculates lighting, textures, and geometry. Without a powerful GPU, working with these tools would be painfully slow and frustrating.
All right, let's see how to choose the best GPU for architecture. One of the common questions is, what's the performance difference between different GPU brands like AMD, Radeon RX 7000 series, or NVIDIA's RTX 4000 series, or NVIDIA's Quadro graphics cards? And then what's the best card and what's the best price and performance ratio? Here, I would first compare AMD Radeon RX 7000 series and NVIDIA's RTX 4000 series because NVIDIA's Quadro graphics cards are simply in the league on their own. Cards like RTX 4070, 4080, and 4090 include RT cores for real-time ray tracing and tensor cores for various AI features. These features can really boost performance in rendering programs like D5 or Lumion, where fast feedback is important. NVIDIA also works much better with architectural software like AutoCAD, Rhino, and Revit. On the other hand, AMD's Radeon RX 7000 series offers great performance for the price, especially for users who don't need advanced ray tracing or AI features, but today, who doesn't need AI features? However, if you're doing standard 3D modeling or general visualization, RX 7900 XTX and RX 7900 XT are excellent value for their lower cost compared to NVIDIA's higher-end cards. That said, my personal preference always leans toward RTX series. The extra features and better optimization for professional software just makes it a no-brainer for me. Now, let's compare NVIDIA's RTX 4000 series with NVIDIA's Quadro series graphics card. The RTX 4000 series is designed mainly for gamers, content creators, and professionals who need high performance for 3D modeling and real-time rendering. These cards are also great for AI applications like Stable Diffusion or ComfUI, which can run locally on your system. On the other hand, NVIDIA Quadro, or now called RTX A series, is built for accuracy and reliability in more critical tasks. These cards also come with additional features and certifications for professional software like AutoCAD and Revit, and this makes them ideal for handling large architectural models and complex tasks. Quadro cards are much more expensive. For example, the RTX A6000, the top model in the Quadro series, costs around $4,800, while RTX 4090, the top consumer model, is priced at about $1,700. That's almost 3 times the price, so unless you absolutely need precision and features of a Quadro card, which most of us don't, the RTX 4000 series offers much better value for most architects and companies. Alright, but which RTX 4000 series card should you choose? This depends on your budget, but I'll give you 3 options here. The first one is the entry-level card RTX 4060 with 8 gigs of VRAM, priced at around $330. Mid-budget option is RTX 4070 with 12 gigs of VRAM, priced at around $650. And the high-end option is RTX 4080 Super with 16 gigabytes of VRAM, priced at around $1,300. The next important part of your configuration is RAM. In short, this is the temporary working memory of your computer. Think of this like your desk space while you're working on a project, and of course, the larger the desk or RAM, the more papers, tools, or models you can spread out and work on at the same time without having to put anything away. For us as architects, RAM is crucial when you're running programs like Rhino, Grasshopper, Revit, or Photoshop, especially when dealing with large 3D models and large files, accessing your material, libraries, etc. The more RAM you have, the more information your computer can hold and work with at once, which means smoother performance when you're switching between tasks. Without enough RAM, your computer has to constantly swap data in and out, like having to put things away and take them out again, which will of course slow down your work a lot. When looking at RAM memory specs, the key things to focus here are the memory type, like DDR4 or DDR5, and the size of the memory sticks measured in gigabytes. Right now, DDR4 and DDR5 are the most common memory types, but DDR5 is the fastest available, so if you're building a new PC today, I highly recommend going with DDR5 because it's much faster. For the size, here's a quick guide. 16 gigabytes of RAM is priced at around $60. 32 to 64 gigabytes is something that I would recommend, and that's priced at around $130 to $200. And 128 gigabytes is if you're working with very large, complex architectural projects, that's priced at around $450. It's really important to check if your motherboard supports DDR5 and also what the maximum RAM size it can handle. You can easily check all of this on the PC Part Picker website, which I showed you earlier in the video. When it comes to brands, I personally like Kingston because they're one of the most reliable on the market, and they also offer a lifetime guarantee on all of their RAM memory. Hard disk is a storage device where all your programs and files are located. There are two main types of storage devices we use today. The first one is HDD or hard disk drive, and the second one is SSD or solid state drive.
HDDs use spinning disks to store data with a mechanical arm that moves to read or write information. HDD is usually much slower because it relies on mechanical parts. Opening large files or running software takes more time, but they typically offer larger storage for a lower price, so they're great for storing all your data that you don't use often. On the other hand, SSDs are much smaller devices. They don't have any mechanical parts, all of the data is stored electronically, and they're much faster, more durable, and much better for running programs. You should always buy an SSD and install your system and your programs here. And if you need more space, you can always get an additional HDD to store the files that you don't use every day. When it comes to the size of the SSD, that's really up to you. I would say that the minimum is 250 gigabytes, that's around $100, and it goes all the way up to 4 terabytes, that's around $300. Here, I would also recommend either Kingston or Samsung M2 SSD sticks.
The last piece of this puzzle is the choice of your power supply. You need to get a power supply that has enough wattage to cover all of your components inside a case, including motherboard, RAM, memory, CPU, GPU, SSD, and case fans. In most cases, you will be fine with 1000 watt power supply.
Once again, you can check out the total wattage of your components on PC Parts Picker website and make sure to give at least 20 or 30% buffer on top of that just to be safe. The brand that I personally like is called Be Quiet because it provides a lot of custom options for cable management. It's fully modular and it's very reliable.
When choosing a monitor, it's not something that directly affects your system's power, but it's still important because, as architects, we work with visuals, materials, colors, renderings, and having a monitor with accurate colors is really helpful.
There are a few key specs that will make your work smoother. The first two are the refresh rate and response time. Look for a monitor with at least 144 Hz refresh rate and a response time under 1 millisecond for smooth visuals. Next, consider the panel type. I recommend IPS panels because they give you more accurate colors compared to TN or VA panels. Also, think about screen size and resolution. A 27-inch monitor is good standard size for most architectural work. For resolution, 2K is fine, but if you want sharper visuals, a 4K monitor will give you much better experience, but of course, it's more expensive.
I won't mention any specific brands, but keep in mind that a typical 27-inch IPS monitor like this one with 2K resolution and 144 Hz refresh rate and 1 millisecond response time usually costs around $250.
If you'd like to see a more comprehensive video breakdown with instructions on how to choose the components for your PC based on the specific budget, click on the first link in the description and check it out. It's inside of our school community and it's completely free.
Okay, now it's time to build. We need to start with your PC case. I didn't talk about PC cases in detail because essentially you can't really make a big mistake when choosing a PC case. The standard mid-tower with ATX supported motherboards should be fine. Just make sure that you take a wider case at around 23 centimeters if you plan on getting that Noctua CP cooler that I recommended earlier.
The PC case that I have here is a bit bigger and it has more room for the airflow and more coolers, but the principles are all the same. The first thing you need to do is screw in your motherboard using the given screw holes. In this particular case, we can screw the motherboard with all the parts first and then put the whole socket back into the case. However, not all cases are like this. In most cases, you would have to screw the motherboard directly. Once that is done, we can also take this cover off. This is where our SSD M2 chip goes. Make sure to take this plastic film off and glue it to the M2 chip. This acts as a heat spreader and it helps lower down the temperature of your SSD. After that, just screw back the cover and you're good to go. After that is done, we can plug in the RAM modules. Here we have 4 sticks of 32 gigs for the total of 128 gigabytes. Make sure to push the RAM sticks until you hear the click sound and they lock in place. This step is really important. Now comes the time when we need to install our CPU and the big Noctua CPU cooler. Installing CPU is not a big deal, it's pretty straightforward. We just need to remove the CPU cover, place the CPU on top and secure it in place with this small pin. But when installing Noctua cooler, we need to install mounting bars first, then apply the thermal paste just as shown in the instructions manual and then screw the cooler in place. Then we can put the whole socket back inside a case and proceed to install the GPU. This is GTX 4080 Super, and as you can see, it's quite long and it covers lots of space on your motherboard. Usually there are two possible PCIe slots where you can place your graphics card, and both of them are fine, but I would always place it in a slot that gives it a bit more room to breathe. And lastly, you can add this anti-sagging bracket. This usually comes with new PC cases and also with the graphics cards, which are this big, but you can also get it online for like 10 bucks. This is also very important because these cards are very heavy and this bracket will simply take some load from the motherboard. The last part is to connect all of the coolers into designated slots on your motherboard, connect the power supply with the motherboard and the GPU. After that, we're ready to turn on our machine.
And now let's answer the question that a lot of you wanted to know. Should you use Windows PC or Mac for architecture? Click here to find out.